If you think this is going to be another video about silver prices, let's slow down and get the real issue on the table. Price is what people argue about on television. Access is what changes quietly in memos and classifications and in emergency procedures that most people never read. Imagine it's a normal morning. You wake up, you make coffee, you open your laptop, and you decide you want to add a little physical silver to what you already have. Not because you're trying to get rich, because you're trying to stay protected. You click through the usual channels and you see something you weren't expecting. Restricted allocation, only delivery, delayed, purchase limits, approved buyers. Not a shortage headline, not a panic, just a subtle change in what the system will allow you to do. This is where most people make the wrong assumption. They assume that if there was a real change coming, it would arrive with a major announcement, a speech, a crisis banner on the news. But that's not how control works in a mature financial system. When something becomes strategically important, the first move is not public, the first move is administrative. This isn't coincidence, because the world is already treating certain materials as national infrastructure, not as retail products. Silver sits in an uncomfortable category. It's a monetary metal in the public imagination, but it's also an input for technologies that governments have committed to build at scale. The combination creates pressure that doesn't show up in the price at first. It shows up in permissions and procurement priority, and in who gets served first when supply tightens. If you're over the age of 60 and you care about protecting savings, this matters for one simple reason. In a stress scenario, having money is not the same thing as having access. The system can leave the price on the screen and still deny you the transaction. That is not a theory. That is how rationing works in modern markets. It's not a soldier at the door. It's a rule change in the pipeline. This pattern has appeared before, and it always begins the same way. First, a material becomes essential to policy goals, then it becomes critical, then it becomes strategic. And once this stage begins, the market stops behaving like a normal consumer market because the highest priority buyer is no longer you. The highest priority buyer becomes an institution, and institutions don't compete the way households do. They don't chase price. They secure supply. So when you hear 2-day window, don't translate that into a trading deadline. Translate it into something more practical, a narrowing gap between a world where silver is treated like an ordinary commodity and a world where it is treated like an asset the system must control. And the moment that shift happens, the question that matters most is no longer, what will silver cost? The question becomes, will you still be allowed to get it the same way you used to? Most people still think about silver the wrong way. And that misunderstanding is exactly why this transition catches them off guard. In the public mind, silver lives in the same mental category as jewelry coins or collectibles. You buy something, you hold something whose importance rises and falls with price charts. That belief feels reasonable because for decades the market treated silver that way. Dealers sold it openly, investors debated premiums, analysts argued about ratios. Everything looked familiar and voluntary. But that frame is outdated. What matters is not how the public defines silver. What matters is how states, regulators, and planners define it when systems are under pressure. And from their perspective, silver is not an investment vehicle. It is a functional input. It is a physical requirement for infrastructure that governments have already committed to build, defend, and scale. Once you see that distinction, the confusion clears. A commodity is something the market allocates through price. A strategic material is something the system allocates through priority. Those are two completely different logics, and they lead to very different outcomes for ordinary holders. This is why people are often shocked when access disappears without a formal ban. They're waiting for a dramatic announcement when the real shift happens through quiet language changes, a redefinition, a reclassification, a footnote in a regulatory framework that changes who comes first when supply tightens. The object does not change. The rules around it do. This isn't coincidence. It's how modern control operates. Governments rarely say you are no longer allowed. Instead, they say, this category now requires coordination, or this material is subject to prioritization. On paper, nothing is forbidden. In practice, the queue is rearranged and the public quietly moves to the back. For someone thinking in terms of price alone, that distinction sounds abstract. But for someone who has lived through shortages, rationing, or financial freezes, it's very real. You can afford something and still be unable to obtain it. You can have liquidity and still be denied delivery. The market can look open while access is already constrained. This pattern has appeared before. Every time a material crosses the line from convenience to necessity. It doesn't happen when demand rises a little. It happens when a system decides it cannot function without guaranteed supply. At that moment, the question shifts from who is willing to pay to who must be served. Once this stage begins, the rules stop responding to individual choice. They respond to system survival. And that is the moment when treating silver like an ordinary consumer asset becomes a dangerous assumption, not because of speculation, but because the framework governing it has fundamentally changed. To understand why this shift keeps catching people by surprise, you need to stop looking at individual events and start looking at the sequence that connects them. What's happening with silver follows a pattern that systems repeat when pressure builds. It is not emotional, it is procedural. The first stage is quiet dependency. A material begins to appear everywhere, but no one talks about it as a bottleneck. It becomes embedded in infrastructure energy systems, communications, and defense, yet it remains publicly labeled as just another input. At this stage, the market still feels normal. Availability looks adequate. Pricing looks manageable. There is no urgency because the system has not yet admitted how dependent it has become. The second stage is acceleration. Demand does not just grow, it compounds. New policies, new technologies, and new mandates stack on top of one another. The same material is now required in more places more frequently and with higher performance standards. Supply does not respond at the same speed, not because producers are incompetent, but because physical production has limits. This is when internal monitoring begins. Governments, agencies, and large institutions start tracking flows more closely, even though nothing changes for the public yet. This is where most people still feel safe because shelves are not empty and headlines are calm. But behind the scenes, the material has already been flagged. It is no longer treated as optional, it is treated as necessary. The third stage is designation. This is the inflection point. The material is formally or informally identified as critical or strategic. Sometimes it appears on an official list, sometimes it shows up in procurement language, sometimes it is embedded in emergency planning documents. The wording is technical, not dramatic. Most people never see it. But from this moment forward, the material is no longer governed primarily by market behavior. It is governed by priority rules. This isn't coincidence. This is how systems protect themselves without causing panic. Designation does not mean seizure. It means reordering. It means the system now reserves the right to decide who gets served first. The fourth stage is allocation. This is where the public begins to feel friction even if they cannot explain why. Delivery times stretch. Purchase limits appear. Approved buyers emerge. Industrial users receive preferential treatment. Contracts replace open market transactions. Nothing is officially banned, but nothing works the way it used to. The market still exists, but it has narrowed. This is the stage where people argue about price while missing the more important change. The issue is no longer affordability. The issue is access. Who is allowed to buy? Who is allowed to store? Who is allowed to move material across borders? Those decisions are now made upstream long before a retail buyer clicks a button. The fifth stage is exclusion. By the time the stage is obvious, it is already too late to react calmly. The system has committed. Supply is locked into priority channels. The remaining availability is thin, volatile, and conditional. Retail participation becomes symbolic. You can still see the asset on a screen, but participation is no longer guaranteed. The system has effectively closed ranks. This pattern has appeared before, not just with metals, but with energy inputs, agricultural resources, and strategic technologies. Each time the transition felt sudden to the public, even though it unfolded gradually inside the system. Once this stage begins, reversal becomes extremely difficult. Not because officials are malicious, but because dependence has become structural. The system cannot risk open access once continuity is at stake. Understanding this sequence matters because it reframes the entire conversation. This is not about predicting a dramatic event. It is about recognizing which stage the system is already in and understanding that by the time exclusion is visible, the decisive moves have already been made. To see why this process becomes unavoidable, you have to look at the physical mechanics beneath the policy language. This is where the story stops being abstract and starts becoming constrained by engineering, chemistry, and time. Silver is not strategic because people decided it should be. It is strategic because there are very few materials that can do what it does at the scale modern systems require. Silver is the most electrically conductive metal available. It performs under heat, under load, and under constant use in a way substitutes simply cannot match without sacrificing efficiency or reliability. When systems are built around performance thresholds, there is no flexibility to improvise later. This matters because the technologies governments are prioritizing are not optional projects. Power grids, renewable energy, capacity, electric vehicles, advanced electronics, and data infrastructure are long-term commitments already written into national plans. Once those commitments are made, the inputs required to sustain them are no longer subject to market preference. They become requirements. This isn't coincidence. It is a consequence of how large systems manage risk. When planners see that a single material sits across multiple critical pathways, they stop treating it as a commodity and start treating it as a vulnerability. And vulnerabilities are never left to open market forces during periods of stress. Now look at the supply side. Silver production is not flexible in the way people assume. The majority of silver does not come from primary silver mines. It comes as a byproduct of copper, zinc, and lead mining. That means silver supply does not increase simply because silver demand increases. It increases only if base metal production increases, and that is driven by entirely different economic signals. Even if prices rise sharply, production cannot be expanded quickly. New mining projects require exploration, permitting financing infrastructure and years of development. In most cases, close to a decade passes between discovery and meaningful output. Above-ground recycling helps at the margins, but it does not scale fast enough to close structural gaps when demand accelerates across multiple sectors at once. This creates a condition planners pay close attention to inelastic supply paired with non-negotiable demand. When that condition appears, intervention becomes a matter of timing, not debate. Waiting too long risks shortages that cascade across energy, transportation, and defense systems. Acting early allows control to be established quietly. This pattern has appeared before, and it always follows the same internal logic. First comes monitoring, then comes coordination, then comes prioritization. Each step is framed as temporary, technical, and reasonable. None of them require a public announcement that access will change. The rules are adjusted upstream where contracts are written and materials are allocated. Once this stage begins, the system's behavior changes even if the public conversation does not. Industrial buyers move from spot markets to long-term agreements. Governments secure supply directly or indirectly. Inventory flows shift towards strategic reserves. What remains in open circulation becomes thinner, more volatile, and more conditional. This is why access disappears before panic arrives. By the time headlines catch up, the material has already been spoken for. The system is not reacting to fear. It is reacting to math. When demand must be met and supply cannot respond, control replaces choice. Understanding this mechanism explains why reclassification does not look dramatic. It doesn't need to. The system doesn't have to tell you silver is strategic in order to treat it that way. It only has to behave as if it is. And when that happens, the most important change is not what silver costs, but who the system allows to touch it at all. When people hear this logic for the first time, they often assume it is speculative. It feels abstract until you recognize that the same sequence has played out repeatedly across different materials, different countries, and different decades. The details change, but the structure does not. This pattern has appeared before, most clearly with uranium. In the early 20th century, uranium was a curiosity. It was traded, collected, and studied with little restriction. As nuclear technology matured, uranium crossed a threshold. It was no longer just a material. It became a strategic input tied directly to national survival. The transition did not begin with a dramatic confiscation. It began with classification, then licensing, then restricted access. Eventually, private ownership and open trade were replaced by state control. By the time the public understood what had happened, the market no longer existed in any meaningful sense. A similar progression unfolded with rare earth elements. For years, they were treated as obscure industrial inputs. Few investors paid attention. Few consumers even knew what they were. As electronics advanced, manufacturing and defense systems became dependent on them. Governments began to view rare earths through a security lens. Export quotas appeared. Supply chains were consolidated. Access shifted away from open markets toward bilateral agreements and state-directed allocation. No single announcement declared the end of the free market. The rules simply evolved until the old market structure could no longer function. Nickel provides another instructive example. For decades, it was traded as a standard industrial metal. Then, electric vehicles and energy storage changed the equation. When governments realized that battery supply chains depended on stable nickel access, intervention followed. Export bans were imposed, domestic processing was prioritized, foreign buyers were forced to adapt to a new framework overnight. Those who assumed continuity discovered that the market they understood no longer existed. What matters about these examples is not the specific metal involved, it is the sequence of decisions. First, dependence grows quietly, then vulnerability is recognized, then control is asserted. In each case, the shift was justified as necessary, temporary, or technical. In each case, access changed before price became the headline issue. This isn't coincidence. It is how systems behave when continuity becomes more important than openness. Markets exist to allocate surplus. Strategic controls exist to protect necessity. When an input crosses from one category into the other, the governing logic changes regardless of public perception. Once this stage begins, reversal almost never happens voluntarily. Even if political leadership changes, the underlying dependency remains. No government willingly gives up control over materials it considers essential to energy security, industrial capacity, or defense readiness. What was framed as an emergency measure quietly becomes permanent infrastructure. These precedents matter because they remove uncertainty about intent. They show that reclassification is not a theoretical risk. It is a well-established response pattern. The only variable is timing. And historically, the public only becomes aware of the shift after access has already been reshaped. Seen in that context, the question surrounding silver is not whether similar logic could be applied. The question is whether the conditions that triggered those past decisions are now present again, and once you recognize that they are the rest of the sequence, it becomes easier to anticipate, Not because it is dramatic, but because it is familiar. To understand where we are right now, you have to stop asking whether this could happen and start asking where the system already is in the sequence. When you do that, the picture becomes much clearer. Look at the signals that matter, not the headlines. Physical inventories at major trading hubs have been trending lower, not because of retail buying frenzies, but because material is being pulled into longer-term channels. Industrial users are locking in supply through contracts that never touch the open market. Governments are labeling silver alongside materials they consider critical for energy transition, grid stability, and advanced manufacturing. None of this is framed as restriction, but all of it quietly reduces what remains available to everyone else. This isn't coincidence. It is what the middle stages of the pattern look like in real time. The system rarely announces that it has entered a new phase. It behaves differently first. Only later does the language catch up. Pay attention to who is moving early. Large institutions are not waiting for confirmation. They are securing exposure through agreements that prioritize delivery over price. They are shifting away from spot dependence toward guaranteed access. That alone tells you how they view risk. They are not worried about short-term volatility. They are worried about continuity. At the same time, the structure of the market is changing in ways most people don't notice. Retail availability still exists, but it is becoming thinner and more conditional. Premiums fluctuate, delivery times extend, limits appear quietly. These are not signs of panic. They are signs of triage. The system is already deciding which channels matter most. This pattern has appeared before, and this is always the phase where confusion dominates. Prices may still move up and down. Commentators debate charts. Analysts argue about ratios. But underneath that noise, allocation is already being reordered. The public conversation lags behind institutional behavior, because institutions act on necessity, not narrative. Once this stage begins, the remaining timeline compresses. The transition from designation to prioritization happens faster than people expect, because much of the groundwork is already in place. The lists exist, the procurement rules exist, the emergency frameworks exist. They do not need to be invented, they only need to be activated. This is why the present moment matters. Not because a dramatic event is guaranteed tomorrow, but because the system is already operating as if silver is too important to leave entirely to the open market. When that mindset takes hold, the direction is set. The only question left is how visible the shift becomes before access changes enough for the public to feel it directly. Understanding where we are in the sequence allows you to see past the surface calm. It reveals that the most consequential moves are not happening on trading screens. They are happening in how supply is being reserved, routed, and protected. And by the time that process becomes obvious to everyone, the system will already have moved on to the next stage. At this point, the logic closes in on itself. There is no dramatic fork in the road where the system pauses and asks permission. Once the conditions are in place, the outcome follows from necessity, not choice. When a material becomes essential to energy infrastructure, industrial continuity, and national planning, open access becomes a liability. No government can afford a scenario where critical supply is disrupted, because allocation was left entirely to market dynamics. In that environment, control is not an overreach. It is the default response. The alternative is exposure, and exposure is unacceptable once dependence becomes structural. This isn't coincidence. It is the end result of a chain of decisions that began long before anyone talked about reclassification. Each step reduced flexibility, narrowed margins, and increased reliance. By the time those pressures converge, there is no neutral option left. Leaving access unrestricted is itself a decision, and it is the riskiest one available. This pattern has appeared before, and in every case, the final transition felt sudden only to those watching from the outside. Inside the system, it felt overdue. By the time priority rules are enforced, inventories have already been mapped, contracts have already been signed, and alternative channels have already been secured. What looks like a sudden shift is actually the visible edge of a process that has been running quietly for years. Once the stage begins, it does not unwind on its own. Strategic designation does not revert back to casual availability simply because markets stabilize or prices adjust. Control frameworks, once activated, become part of baseline planning. They may loosen at the margins, but they do not disappear. The system does not give up leverage it has already deemed necessary. That is the unavoidable conclusion. Not that silver must spike tomorrow or that an announcement must be made, but that the conditions which force reclassification are already present, and systems do not ignore those conditions indefinitely. They act on them in the least disruptive way possible, which almost always means acting early and quietly. In that context, the most important shift is already behind us. The conversation has moved from whether silver matters to how it will be managed. And once a system reaches that point, access is no longer governed by individual intent or market enthusiasm. It is governed by institutional priority. There is nothing emotional about this outcome. It is procedural. It is defensive. It is consistent with every historical precedent where necessity replaced choice. And when viewed through that lens, the trajectory no longer feels uncertain. It feels settled even if the surface remains calm. At this stage, the most useful response is not urgency, and it is not prediction. It is clarity. Action in this context does not mean reacting to headlines or trying to outguess short-term moves. It means understanding what kind of exposure you actually have, and what kind of exposure you think you have. The first question is not about return, it is about control. When you look at the assets you rely on for protection, ask yourself whether your access depends on continuous system permission. Paper claims, pooled products, and intermediated exposure all function well when systems are calm. They function very differently when priority rules are activated. Ownership on paper and control in practice are not the same thing once allocation replaces choice. The second question is about timing, not in the sense of trading, but in the sense of sequence. Systems do not change rules retroactively to protect late participants. They formalize what is already happening. The advantage always lies with those who position themselves before access became conditional. Waiting for clarity often means waiting until options narrow, because clarity usually arrives after decisions are already operational. The third question is about concentration of risk. Many people assume diversification means spreading across instruments that all sit inside the same framework. In a prioritization scenario, that framework itself is the risk. Assets that rely on the same settlement channels, the same custodians, or the same regulatory permissions tend to behave similarly when stress emerges. True diversification in this sense is not about variety. It is about independence. This isn't coincidence. People who navigate system transitions successfully are rarely the most aggressive. They are the most deliberate. They do not chase narratives. They position quietly early and with an understanding of how rules change under pressure. They assume continuity will fail at the margins, not at the center, and they plan accordingly. Once this stage begins, the cost of waiting is not measured only in price. It is measured in optionality. Each delay reduces the number of choices available, even if nothing dramatic appears to be happening on the surface. By the time constraints become visible to everyone, the remaining paths tend to be crowded, expensive, or closed. This is not a call to abandon the system or to distrust every institution. It is a call to recognize how systems behave when materials move from convenience to necessity. The goal is not to predict an exact outcome. The goal is to avoid being structurally dependent on a single set of rules at the exact moment those rules are most likely to change. Action then is not a single move. It is a posture. It is the decision to align your exposure with how the system actually operates, rather than how it is described during calm periods. And in moments like this, that alignment matters far more than speed noise or certainty. What happens next is where most people lose the thread because they assume the story ends once a material is reclassified. In reality, that is where the second phase begins. Reclassification is not the event. It is the trigger that changes how everything downstream behaves. Once the stage begins, price stops being the primary signal. Access becomes the signal. You start to see situations where quoted prices still exist, but delivery is delayed, conditional, or redirected. Contracts replace open transactions. Priority clauses appear where none existed before. The system doesn't announce these shifts as turning points. It treats them as routine adjustments, even though their impact is structural. This isn't coincidence. It is how systems preserve continuity without creating panic. By the time the public notices that something feels different, the important decisions have already been embedded into process. What looks like market friction is often policy expressing itself quietly. The next question then is not whether silver will be treated differently, but what happens after it is. How does allocation work when a material is both monetary and industrial? How does priority get enforced when demand comes from multiple strategic directions at once? And how does the system decide who is essential and who is optional when supply tightens further? This pattern has appeared before, and the moment after reclassification is always when confusion peaks. People argue about motives. They debate whether restrictions are temporary. They wait for reassurance that never quite arrives. Meanwhile, the system moves forward as if the new framework is already permanent. That is the conversation we need to have next. Not about fear and not about speculation, but about the mechanics of what follows once control replaces openness. Because understanding that phase is the difference between reacting late and recognizing the shift while options still exist. In the next part, we will examine what actually happens after reclassification when price no longer determines access, and when the market you thought you understood quietly stops functioning the way it used to.